the uh, Karl Popper as interpreted by David Deutsch is always a great thing to listen to. Two brilliant people. But I mean, of course, Popper was completely right about this. Seen purely as a way of getting your way, democracy obviously fails. And if that's the yardstick by which we measure it, none of us would vote. Seen as a way of being able to turn the rascals out peacefully and by agreement, it's extremely successful. It lowers the cost for participation. It means that politics is open to people of goodwill who don't have to be kind of military dictator types. And it has, in practice, until now, worked remarkably well, at least when compared to all the other systems.
I have with me today Lord Daniel Hannan. Among his many achievements, too many to articulate in full, author, speaker, one-time member of the European Parliament, a position he got himself deliberately sacked from because he was too successful in prosecuting his case. He was a chief catalyst, maybe chief cause of Britain leaving the EU. Lord Hannan is now a member of the House of Lords in Britain. Welcome, Lord Hannan, to the Conjecture Institute podcast.
Well, thank you, Brett. Thank you. What a generous introduction. I was thinking I'd like to meet that guy you're talking about. He sounds very interesting.
Now, firstly, you are a lord, but there are lords and there are lords. I've only learned this recently. Not all lords are members of the House of Lords. Some are just honorary titles, like a knighthood, I guess. But you're actually a working member of the British Parliament. The House of Lords is kind of like our Senate, somewhat less like the US Senate, I suppose. But actually, it's different to either of those. So what is the House of Lords and what sets it apart from, let's say, the Australian Senate or senates within the Commonwealth more broadly?
Right. Well, actually, let's start with what it's got in common with them, because that, I think, describes its purpose very well before we come on to its composition. There's a story which is almost certainly apocryphal, sadly, about Thomas Jefferson coming back from having been ambassador to Paris and being horrified to discover that there was an upper house in contravention of strict Republican principles in the United States. And the story goes that he went to see Washington and said, "Why are we doing this? This was not what the revolution was about." And Washington said, "Why did you just pour your tea into your saucer?" And Jefferson said, "To cool it." And Washington said, "Precisely." So what is the function of any upper house? It is to act as a check on what may be a transient public mood in what is necessarily a radical, because directly elected, lower house. And that means that we are subordinate, we're the weaker chamber, quite rightly in a democracy. But our function, I've always understood as being that really basically Burkean function of linking the interests of one generation to those who have gone before and those who will come after. And therefore, if you like, being in the most literal sense of the word conservative, in that you're preventing people immediately acting on what may be a tabloid campaign or a sudden explosion of emotion about something, but ultimately not able to stand in the way. And I think that is true in Australia. I think it's true of the Canadian Senate. I think it's true of the US Senate. They're all constituted differently, but they all have that same function as the House of Lords. New Zealand, of course, it's the outlier, scrapped its upper house, maybe a little bit easier in a population of, well, I think they were less than 3 million when they did that. What makes us then different? Actually, I think if you were an Australian senator, on one level, you'd feel very at home. The iconography is very similar. Everything is the same colour. We've got the same dark red and green for the elected chamber that I think almost every provincial state parliament has in Australia, or provincial.
Except for Queensland does not have an upper house either.
Except Queensland, exactly. But no, the difference, of course, is that we still have this very unusual thing of people there by birth, and not for much longer. So the House of Lords was originally a purely hereditary chamber. You could get there only by being a earl or duke or whatever, i.e. by being your father's son or by being given one of these hereditary titles. And that goes right back to Magna Carta. That goes right back to the idea of a council of bishops and barons to constrain and advise the monarchy and ensure that the king keeps to certain conditions laid out in the coronation ceremony. So it's a very old chamber, and we date it with a little bit of romanticism, but not completely wrongly, to 1215. It actually worked incredibly well until we had the Lloyd George Liberal government at the end of the First World War. And he started creating immense numbers of peerages for money. I mean, he was selling them for party donations, which is not something we'd ever really encountered before. And so the number of hereditary titles exploded to the point where people said, we just can't keep doing this. The chamber is getting too big. So eventually, in 1958, they instituted the office of a life peer, i.e. someone who has the right to sit in the House of Lords, but whose title dies with him. And that's what most of us are. That's what I am, is what 90% of the chamber is. Though the interesting thing is that a small number of hereditaries managed to hang on, despite Tony Blair coming to office pledged to get rid of them. Tony Blair came in and said, this is fusty, it's medieval, it's outrageous, contravention of every decent principle of democracy. How can you have people here just because they're their father's sons? Actually, the Tories said, well, we kind of agree with that. We're not going to die in the ditch over this. It is slightly weird having a hereditary element. But what are you going to put in its place? It's got to be something better. You can't just say we're going to get rid of something without giving us any clue of what the replacement will be. Blair said, oh, I'm not falling for that. You know, as soon as we get drawn into what should replace it, nothing will happen. So he went for this unilateral abolition, promising that there would be a second stage reform that would lead to some kind of accountable upper chamber. The Tories were correctly sceptical. They didn't believe he would do it, and they were right not to believe that he would do it. And so eventually the deal was done where the hereditary peers said, okay, we will let you push this legislation through. We won't delay it. We won't bugger up your whole legislative agenda. In exchange for you leaving 100 of us here as guarantors to ensure that you finally get round to it, like a little pebble in the shoe. And that was eventually haggled down to 90, and then it was increased to 92 because they'd forgotten these two kind of important Crown office holders. And they have been there ever since, with a by-election process when one of them dies. And Labour is now getting rid of them. I mean, literally, as we record this, we're in the middle of the legislative process to get rid of them, which I kind of think is outrageous because they still haven't got round to the second stage reform. So we're now going to end up in this position where the chamber is wholly appointed by the executive. And I do feel that that is the worst of all. I mean, it is worse than having a hereditary chamber because if you think about it, you know, going right back to Magna Carta, what is the purpose of a legislature? It is to constrain the executive, which is obviously a purpose that is going to be prejudiced if one of the two chambers is completely appointed by the executive. And by the way, I always think it's worth making that point. And I make that point to my parliamentarian friends in every country. We are not there as legislators. Using that word gives us a really false idea of our primary purpose. We're not there to pass laws, we're not there to speak in debates, we're not there to sit on committees, we're not even there to represent constituents if we have them. Those things are all bonuses, they're all valuable activities, but they are not fundamentally why we're there. We are there to prevent the executive exceeding its powers. That was why the House of Lords was created at Magna Carta. It's why the House of Commons was added to it 50 years later, or an ancestor of the House of Commons. And it's the model that we exported to the rest of the Anglosphere. And the day that we forget that we are there to stop the government getting too big for its boots, the day that we start thinking that we're there to add to the statute book, is the day that we have lost our primary function. And I say this with particular intensity to any American congressman who happen to watch, as I'm sure all of them do, Brett, your podcast. Because it seems to me that we are watching there. We have been watching actually for decades, but it's particularly severe under Trump. This absolute abdication of their primary responsibility.
I had to smile there where you said you're not there to pass laws, you're not legislators, because it made me immediately think, well, that sounds a little bit like the reason I first came across you, which was being a member of the European Parliament. That parliamentary body also apparently not there to actually part rules, in contravention to what I think almost all people would think the European Parliament actually does. This first came across sort of my attention when David Deutsch started tweeting about what was undemocratic about the European Union. This idea that the Parliament itself didn't actually have the power to draft legislation, that in fact it was taken out of the hands of the elected people and given to a bunch of bureaucrats appointed who couldn't be removed. And as we like to say, David likes to say, quoting Karl Popper, for example, in arguing against Plato, Plato's idea of democracy was that the demos would rule, that it would devolve into mob rule. But Popper said, if you instead replace the question of who should rule with how do you most effectively remove rulers and rules that you do not like, that is the proper function of a democracy. And so it was then that I went down the rabbit hole of all your various videos, of getting a hold of your book, and then listening to Why Vote Leave as well. And I began to have a deeper and deeper understanding of just the poverty of what the EU was all about. That it seemed like the entire intellectual class were all saying, remain, remain, remain. What a wonderful idea this is, especially if you're a wealthy person in Britain and you get to cross the borders without having to stand in line, that kind of thing. So they were focusing on this kind of thing, the ability to move freely. Great, wonderful, we like that kind of idea. But they seemed to ignore the fact that the power wasn't being devolved to the local area, but instead was being concentrated in a place where you could not have any effect on the legislative process. As a person who was being ruled by these rulers from Brussels, can you tell me a little bit about this central problem of a lack of democracy with the European Union and what your role was there? After all, as I say, you're a member of the European Parliament, but you didn't have that much power.
So the good things that you are talking about that come from collaboration and working together with our neighbours and so on, we could have had all of that without a proto-government. And it's a point that is often deliberately missed, I think, in bad faith in the UK debate. But the fundamental problem with the idea of a united Europe, of a federal Europe, is that it didn't have the basic loyalties and allegiances that are necessary for the function of a successful state. States work best within nations. And what I mean by a nation in this context is a unit where we feel that we have enough in common one with another to accept government from each other's hands. Now that often overlaps with language. It can overlap with culture, religion, history, geography, all sorts of things. You know, it's a difficult thing to define, but that doesn't make it any less real. We all know it when we see it. And very few people outside Brussels itself feel European in the same sense that somebody might feel Swedish or Portuguese or Hungarian. And that was always the fundamental problem. There was no demos. There was no unit within which we identified as a we, what Roger Scruton always used to talk about as the politics of the first person plural. We all know, you know, if I say, you know, we had a great success at the rugby the other day, I mean, depending on which side you're on, we'll know what we meant by the we, right? And that is simply not the case at European level. And that's why we had this weirdly anti-democratic system. It's not an accident. It's not a bug. It was an absolutely deliberate design. The founders of the EU, coming out of the Second World War, had a passionate and sincere belief in merging the nation states together. They thought this was the only way to avoid further wars. But they also knew that scheme, that extraordinarily bold and ambitious scheme to jam all of these kingdoms and republics together and create a new nation state with its own police force and army and external borders and parliament and head of state and all the rest of it, that would never work if you had to keep going back to ask for approval from the national electorates. And so they very deliberately created a system where executive and legislative power was combined in the hands of a European Commission whose members are unelected, unaccountable, and deliberately invulnerable to public opinion. Right? This was not this didn't grow up accidentally over time. This was how it was designed from 1956 in the Treaty of Rome and its predecessors in the Coal and Steel Community. It was deliberately done as a way of tempering the hot-headed publics who you never know, if left to themselves, might vote for another Mussolini. Right? And so the European Parliament, therefore, was this rather bizarre organisation because it was supposed to lend apparent democratic legitimacy And yet it had, actually, I probably had about the same power there as I have now as a member of the House of Lords. Occasional delay, occasional blocking. They could sometimes initiate legislation, but I can do it much more easily now as a member of the Lords. They did have slightly more power over financial control than we do in the Lords, because we accepted from the 18th century that was a Commons thing here. So I'd say about equivalent. Of course, the people who got there, being self-selected Euro-integrationists, didn't see their job as being to constrain the Commission in any sense at all. They saw themselves as being there to amplify the Commission's campaigns for more integration. And that was really all they ever did. That, why can't we Europeanize this? Why can't we have a common policy on, herbal remedies or whatever the thing of the, AI or whatever? And of course, that was fundamentally at odds with the basic role of a representative assembly. The Karl Popper, as interpreted by David Deutsch, is always a great thing to listen to. Two brilliant people. But I mean, of course, Popper was completely right about this. Seen purely as a way of getting your way, democracy obviously fails. And if that's the yardstick by which we measure it, none of us would vote. Seen as a way of being able to turn the rascals out peacefully and by agreement, it's extremely successful. It lowers the cost for participation. It means that politics is open to people of goodwill who don't have to be kind of military dictator types. And it has, in practice, until now, worked remarkably well, at least when compared to all the other systems. Now, whether how long that will carry on, I'm beginning to ask whether it will survive an increasingly kind of post-literate culture. I'm starting to wonder. I still can't see anything better, and I'm a strong defender of it, but I'm beginning to sense for the first time that I might lose, and I might live to see a very successful liberal democratic order replaced by something altogether colder and darker and grimmer.
We hope not. Before we come back to that, this idea of the EU in particular ignoring the will of the people, again, it was brought home to me. For a second time, I re-listened to Why Vote Leave. And it's astonishing to me the number of times a referendum would be held in a member state somewhere and the EU would just ignore it. Or in one case, Ireland, I think, was voting on something or other. And they didn't like the outcome of the referendum, and so not only did they send the Irish back for a second time, but they changed the rules of how the referendum operated so that the second time it did indeed pass. I got a similar story from here in Australia. You may well be aware of the Voice to Parliament referendum that happened. And the Voice to Parliament referendum was roundly defeated here. The whole idea of the Voice to Parliament was an Indigenous voice to Parliament, where not only would we have the House of Reps and the Senate, we would also have an Indigenous body, apparently elected from the Indigenous community here in Australia, somehow able to sit on equal footing with the other two houses of Parliament. We weren't really sure how it was going to work, but Australians voted roundly 60-40 against having such a body. Nevertheless, even though the state of Victoria also individually voted against it, their government has just decided to go right ahead and run roughshod over the will of the people. Do you have any explanation as an insider in politics of why would you go against not just the vibe or the feeling that the people might be against you, but the expressly publicised will of the people through a referendum? Why would they do that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you are right, Brett, to remind our listeners that this is not an exclusively EU problem. It has happened elsewhere. And in fact, maybe the best parallel from an Australian context, although I'm not the expert, would be the Western Australia secession referendum, the sort of the Wexit, if you want to call it that, which was then just completely ignored. However, I think it is fair to say, and I think even my Euro-federalist friends would not really dispute, that this tendency is much stronger in the European Union, where public opinion is treated not as a reason to change direction, but as an obstacle to remove from your path. What you describe as having happened in Ireland happened twice. That Ireland voted and, try again, Paddy. We'll say it more slowly for you this time. Was made to vote again. And it happened. Referendums were ignored or struck down or rerun in Denmark, in the Netherlands, in France. I mean, it's a very, very common. In fact, more referendums have been ignored than have been obeyed in the history of the EU. Referendums on the subject of Europe, and that's so. Why does it happen? Well, actually, I think in a way the more interesting question is why doesn't that happen all the time? If you feel very strongly about something, the idea that you hand over judgment about that something to a bunch of strangers does not come naturally. I think it's a quite extraordinarily difficult idea for a lot of, which is why in lots and lots of countries, the joke after the independence of a lot of the African colonies was one man, one vote once. Once you get in, why would you allow a bunch of, as you would see it, unpatriotic idiots to take over and make a mess of everything? And it requires an awful lot of education and acculturation to habituate people to that idea. And it doesn't work everywhere. One of the things that always interested me growing up in South America and being educated in the UK was the difference between culture in the Hispanosphere and the Anglosphere. Both, Christian, Western cultures. And, the South American republics and then later Spain very much modelled on the same democratic system as the English-speaking world. The South American and Central American states generally became independent between about 1810 and about 1822. By then, the US Constitution was already seen as successful. Most of them copied it, or versions of it, very close. And yet they have not had the history that the US had. They've lurched from one dictatorship to another. They've had revolutions. They've had military rule. They've had communist insurgency. Everything except the regular transfer of power that we've come to take for granted in the Anglosphere. Maybe Uruguay gets closest to it, but very few others. And you've got to ask, why is that? And the more I think about it, the more I've thought that actually it's a bit like saying, where does poverty come from? We've put the question back to front. Poverty is a completely natural thing. The question is, where does wealth come from? Poverty is primordial. Or when people say, where does corruption come from? Same thing, right? Extraordinary that for 10,000 years it was perfectly natural for the people in charge to loot the state in a systematic way and then give their kids the same privilege. For me, the interesting thing is not why the rest of the Americas did not become more like the US or Canada. It's how the US and Canada, for so long, kept going with this extraordinarily difficult idea that even when you lose, you still obey the rules. That even when the law is a stupid law, you follow it. That even when you don't want to pay taxes to support a bunch of people you don't like, you still pay. That even when your party has been completely obliterated, you don't demand secession for your little bit, and you carry on valuing the will of your fellow citizens. Now, I think the amazing thing is that the US has kept that going for 250 years with only one serious interruption. And Canada has kept it going to this day with a degree of success that actually almost nowhere else in the world has matched. There's a civility and a fair-mindedness in Canadian elections that I can't think of any parallel apart from maybe Switzerland. And that's a hell of a thing to hang on to in the current angry mood that we've got everywhere else.
Yeah, you actually mentioned there you're in this unusual situation. Surely it's not unique, but you're South American. You're born Lima, Peru, fluent in Spanish, French. You've got a deep interest in all things Iberian. But you do say very early on, just again your book here, in Inventing Freedom, that, and I'll quote one part of it, you say, "It is hard to sustain the idea that the English and Spanish-speaking worlds are two manifestations of a common Western civilization," end quote. So they don't come from the same Western civilization. They're not drawing from the same kind of ideology and ideas. I spent a little bit of time in South America and got really fascinated, in particular with Bolivia, and just the sheer number of coups that happened over time. What makes the difference? Why is there that instability in places that descend, let's say, from Spain? I don't want to pick on Spain necessarily, but let's say Spain, as compared to places that descend from the United Kingdom?
Yeah, so good question. I think Bolivia leads the world, actually. I think they've had 91 coups. in roughly 200 years of being a republic, which is quite something, including a very recent one. So why is that? I think, I mean, here I'm just going to borrow from Tocqueville. It's what Tocqueville called your starting point, your point de départ. Where did you bring your institutions from? The Spanish American possessions were basically, they tried to run them from Spain, from the Escorial Palace, and or from the or from the church authorities. And they also had, they had the other bit, if you like, especially in somewhere like Bolivia, where there's a big indigenous population, the people on whom they were superimposing that system had also come from a very autocratic, authoritarian model, like the rest of the world, right? This is not unusual. It wasn't something peculiar to the Incas, but they had your classic thing where there was an emperor at the top and then a kind of priest warrior class, and then everyone else was basically a slave or a serf. And that's a completely normal way for all post-agrarian societies to develop. The extraordinary thing was what happened in English-speaking societies and maybe some very nearby societies in northwestern Europe in the last 300 or 400 years, where we moved away from that system and we stopped defining relationships as being mediated by caste or birth or tradition. And we came up with this brilliant idea that you and I could just reach a deal. And we didn't need to ask the king's permission. We could sign a contract. And suddenly the individual was elevated above the collective. It's a very, very funny story. And I think this one is not apocryphal. I really hope it's not. That Stanley Baldwin, who was Conservative Prime Minister for a lot of the interwar period, and was a decent but anti-intellectual guy, was asked towards the end of his life whether he'd been influenced by any thinkers. And rather to the surprise of the interviewer, he said, actually, yes, I was. As a young man, I was very much influenced by the thinking and writing and teaching of Sir Henry Maine, great Victorian anthropologist. He said, it was by reading Maine that I came to understand that all human progress is really the story of the move from status to contract. And then he paused, frowning, and said, or was it the other way around? Which is a lovely, cute story because it shows how even the most brilliant ideas become worn, through familiarity. But just those three words, status to contract. I mean, just that. Everything else is implied by it. And when we think about Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the US Constitution, all of the things that made this amazing liberal capitalist utopia, about which we are so ungrateful, and whose benefits we take for granted, and all of the gripes which are intrinsic in the human condition we blame on it, that is all really just the elevation of contract. That implies that you and I are not defined by how we were born. And we can all see what a difficult idea that is. We see it with the identity politics movement, which took the form that you mentioned with the Indigenous Voice to Parliament. We see equivalents of that in every country in the world. We're a tribal species. We evolved in kin groups. We very naturally fall into collectivist and authoritarian and hierarchical assumptions. And yet keeping that alive, the idea of contract, the idea of personal autonomy, has been the greatest guarantor of freedom and prosperity and happiness that the human race has ever known.
And as you eloquently put it, that has to be invented. These are not things that come naturally to us. We come from tribal societies. We come from a species of people that tends to look up to the strong man, look up to the chief or the medicine man, the expert, whatever happens to be. And so it can be quite challenging to people's intuitions. They have to be educated into, or inculcated if you like, into these ideas that very much the English and the Scottish had to come up with first. And it seems to me there is a dearth of people trying to defend these ideas now. In fact, it's far more common to hear in the intellectual sphere people railing against colonialism or colonization. That seems to be on people's minds again. And again, if we go to the great colonizers around the world, wherever you want to put, Spain on that list, or the Turkish colonizers and Chinese, the British brought with them great benefits when it came to liberty. And you just look at the experiments that have been run in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, and so on. They're all success stories, none perfect perhaps, but they haven't suffered the kind of coups, dictatorship, protectionism, socialism that you end up with, again, going back to South America. One interesting parallel with Bolivia, again, is, as you would know, it's been described as a pauper on a king's throne. I mean, they have, just at a place like Lake Eugenie, this huge salt lake, and they're sitting on more lithium, basically, than just about anywhere, but they're not exploiting it because they have this socialist government that wants to nationalise everything all the time. At least that's the impression I get. And I feel like that rings true here at the moment to many Australians, because we sit atop a bedrock of coal greater than anywhere else in the world, just about, and uranium, pitch blende ore, greater than anywhere else in the world. But what do we do with it? We export it to other places and then try and live by net zero at the moment. That brings me to net zero. Recently, our opposition has decided to give up on this notion, this sort of suicidal, self-flagellating notion. Where is the UK with this, and what do you think globally about this push towards net zero that especially the UN has got going at the moment?
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that. Let me run through a couple of the things you said. First of all, on resource extraction, you would much rather be Australian than Bolivian, right? And there's a reason for that. I taught an economics class for a bit, and I would begin my first lesson. I would show the students a clip from that movie Blood Diamonds, where the plot of which is that somebody in a sort of unnamed West African state discovers diamonds, and then it brings horror. You end up being chased by warlords and so on. It's the worst thing that could have happened. And then I show them a clip from that comedy series Beverly Hillbilly, where somebody shoots a possum and a spout of oil comes out and he then becomes an oil millionaire. And I begin by saying to the student, always the same first lesson, which of these is accurate? Are the resources the curse that bring the warlords and the disaster? Or are they the blessing that turn this guy into an undeserving millionaire, but enrich everybody else along the way? And of course, by the end of the lesson, somebody gets there, right? It depends which country you're in. It's the basic why nations fail. Do you live in an inclusive or an extractive society? Now, with all of its problems, Australia with net zero is an inclusive state. It has made a decision about what the externality is, and it's made that decision lawfully. But it is not a state where you stand to lose everything because of a whimsical expropriation overnight. And that fundamentally is why Australians do not, in large numbers, emigrate to Bolivia, whereas Bolivians would gladly emigrate to Australia if Australia hadn't had Tony Abbott's approach to immigration, which has been largely kept up by subsequent governments. So just before we get on to net zero, though, there's something else you very interestingly said, which when you said, all of these things are counterintuitive, they need to be taught because they're counterintuitive. I mean, I think that's true. We all struggle against it. And I would say that the history of the human race, since we discovered the liberal capitalist model, is a series of rebellions against it, temperamental rebellions against it, because our inner caveman cannot bring himself to accept the parameters within which we now live. Fascism and communism, and in a less harmful form, existentialism, even romanticism, they are all howls of protest by the inner caveman. Oh, why are we living in such a materialist world? Why have we lost sight of what really matters? Why have we lost the values that really count, like sacrifice and faith and blah, blah, blah. It's a very, very natural thing. If you think not just of our sort of folk stories that define us, but think of our science fiction. Think of Star Wars or Dune or something. It's all full of emperors and princesses, and so we, on some really deep genetic level, we are programmed to hierarchy, like any other chimpanzee troop, right? And therefore, what we are doing in creating this little bubble is highly unnatural. My friend Jonah Goldberg had a brilliant. He wrote a book about this where he had this lovely metaphor. He talked about it as the oasis. After discovering agriculture, we metaphorically wandered in the desert for 10,000 years, the desert being oppression, serfdom, slavery, brutality. And then we stumbled upon the oasis, the property-based, contract-based model that the Anglosphere takes for granted now. Every direction we go in leads back into the desert. North, south, up, down, forwards, backwards, you end up back in the desert. But every generation thinks that they've found some clever new direction, and we have to we keep going through this, and that in a way is where we are. And I'm beginning to fret for various reasons, mainly to do with sort of short attention spans we have in our screen-addled age, that we are struggling more than previous generations, or at least than our parents and grandparents, to hang on to the good things that we've got. Finally, on where did Britain get to with net zero? I think there has been a change in the public mood about this around the world. I think we often make this, you and I were unusual in being unconvinced by this all the way. But I think that on net zero, it's actually rather like what happened with lockdown. People went along with a policy that the costs of which they now regret. And they backdate the moment of their own conversion. And they say, why did all these idiot politicians insist on foisting this terrible policy on us? Politicians are self-interested. They want to get re-elected. The net zero policies that we adopted were popular at the time, just as the lockdown measures were popular at the time. As a country, I think we've shifted ground on it. Not completely. There are still plenty of advocates of it. But I think that there is now much more of a consensus that we should make, given time, there will be an eventual shift towards renewable energy as the costs of extraction rise and as the costs of technology fall. And that, there may be an argument for the government just pushing that process along with some light touch regulation, but that what is being proposed under the net zero system is just impossible. It's ludicrously expensive and largely symbolic. And to bankrupt yourself in this way so as to make a point, to rip out an entire system of energy and then replace it with something more expensive. Nobody's ever done that before. And that really is a way of ruining yourself and therefore hastening the end of the political order that you as countries uphold.
Well, I know the US has stepped away substantially from any of these kind of policies, really, certainly at the federal level at least. But in Australia, I just find it particularly perverse because the level of our emissions is less than 1% of the global total, something like that. And yet we are making these grand announcements about how we're going to lead the world when it comes to renewable energy, all the while still exporting vast quantities to mainly China, but also India. And so the emissions are still going to be there if that's what you're really concerned about. If you're really concerned about emissions, you'd switch off the export of the coal.
Of course. But Brett, here's the thing. I mean, you guys, I think, started this debate the better part of a decade before anyone else, even in the US. The Plimer book and all. It was a really and you were changing leaders on the basis of climate change policy a decade before anyone else. And I think that the reason for that, my thesis as a friend of Australia but as a non-Australian, is that the stakes were higher either way for Australia. In other words, Australia is more vulnerable. It is a hot, dry country with a hole in the ozone layer. If the worst of the predictions of doom are accurate, Australia is much more at risk than Britain is. 2-degree rise in temperature is actually quite good news for us, right? So on the one hand, the stakes are. On the other hand, you are, of course, a big, as you said, you're sitting on this extraordinary wealth and you're exporting it, and Australia, I think, pretty much the only big economy that came through the financial crisis without a downturn. Incredible long period of successive quarters of growth because of lots of things, but partly because of the resource wealth. So if the prophets of doom are wrong, the cost is also much higher, and therefore either way it was bound to be a bigger deal in Australia than in other places. And my sense is that you guys are just further ahead in the debate for that reason, and that the rest of the world will end up reaching whatever consensus you guys come to first.
I think also that there's something to be said for just the memeplex that tends to travel through the education system as well. So, science syllabi, especially across the West, certainly in my own country, are just saturated with teaching kids all about climate doomerism. You have these kids, unfortunately, being interviewed by media on the street, and, they're in tears. Sort of the Greta Thunberg level of emotion kind of thing has seeped in. So it's hard to predict that it's going anywhere soon if the children, the next generation of voters are going to be voting on the basis that they think there's an existential threat to their livelihoods. You hear surveys about, young women saying they don't want to have children because, well, what's the point? The world's going to end. So there is this, and I don't know what you think about this, almost a conspiracy theory, but this idea that very much the World Economic Forum, the UN, they are pushing this so that they can regulate ever more. And it seems like, given that COVID didn't quite succeed, just maybe the climate change alarmism is the very vehicle that's going to allow them to, you like to talk about devolving powers, but to actually grant more powers to these supranational bodies.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think the human race is programmed for apocalypse. Every religion has a sort of Ragnarok end of days scenario. The Zoroastrians have that. Everybody has. And in a secular age, we come up with alternatives. Now, you and I are old enough to remember when everybody was worried about a nuclear war. And the mushroom cloud was a familiar icon. We saw it on record sleeves and book covers and movie posters, and there was this huge corpus of apocalyptic literature. I mean, from On the Beach to Mad Max. If we just stick with Australia before we get to the rest of the world. Now, isn't it odd that at a time when objectively we are probably more at risk of a nuclear strike than we were then, in the sense that many more countries have the bomb, and in the sense that we are in the middle of a war where one side is talking explicitly about nuclear responses, isn't it odd that we've all just moved on, that no one seems that worried about it anymore? And I think the reason that we've moved on fundamentally is because we've only really got room for one disaster scenario, one end of days at a time, and the green end of days scenario has replaced the nuclear apocalypse. I wondered whether it would in turn be replaced by a post-COVID one, a 28 days later one. But actually, it's been a bit more resilient. But it will move on to something else. I just think
do you know what it's going to move on to? You know what's waiting in the wings? The AI doom. The AI is going to kill it. And I'm not joking. I think that the authoritarians that are waiting for climate change to go the way of the dinosaur, or someone produces a paper that says actually climate change is good, they will point to the need to regulate technology, because if you want to prevent the AI taking over the world, and there are, I don't know, like I've been tweeting out recently about, philosopher Nick Bostrom wrote this book back in 2011, something like that. Yeah, 2014. Superintelligence. But then, because that didn't seem to do the job, the most recent one was Eliezer Yudkowsky, who wrote, "If anyone builds it, everyone dies." So, I mean, it's just like a marketing strategy of hyping up the end time. So, you just wait. Once climate change ceases to be the bogeyman that it is, the superintelligence is coming.
I remember reading, actually, I read Nick Bostrom's book when it came out. And you remember, he starts with that very striking metaphor about the sparrows and the owls. The sparrows, get some owl eggs and hatch them and say, these owls are going to be great. They're going to hunt for us, and they're going to, and then they start thinking, oh, how do you tame an owl? Now, it is therefore quite interesting to me that Nick Bostrom, although he wants to have sort of, Asimovian rules in place to ensure that the owls are tamed, is still very pro the thing, right? He is in no doubt that AI is a good thing if we make the appropriate tweaks, and that it will make us a richer and happier species. And I think that is palpably the case. That yes, there are challenges, like there are with climate, right? I mean, when people say climate change denier, I always think like, I've never met anyone who argues for climate stasis. Right? I mean, it's like, we can all see that there are climate changes. The question is, what is an appropriate, affordable, proportionate response to a specific problem? And you don't You don't find that appropriate response if you start from a position of millenarian gloom. And I would say exactly the same about AI. Yeah, yes, there is an identified issue that you've got all of these CEOs co-signing letters saying we do need sensible regulation on this, and yet all of them are dashing to get there first. Now, that is a remediable problem to me. Like adaptation and sensible, proportionate moves against excessive climate change is a remediable problem. It doesn't. Neither of them is helped if you start from a level of Greta Thunberg hysteria, because you're not fundamentally interested in solutions. Then you're preaching the end of days, which has its place theologically, but it is of very little value if you're trying to make practical political solutions.
And it seems like all of these existential risk type things, it seems to me in my experience of reading about it, quite often the purported solution calls for something more like a global government. Because if one of us is not going to do the thing like reduce emissions or prevent research into AI, then someone will. So therefore we need to have much more authority vested into these, not necessarily international agreements, just top-down kind of UN style legislation.
Yeah, it's very significant, and that tells you, if you like, where people have started from. And yet, one of the things I've always found rather puzzling and depressing is that because you are expected to have this globalist and bureaucratic and high tax response to everything, it's assumed that if you don't have those things, you're somehow in favor of pollution or in favor of, dirty rivers or something. I mean, the clue is in the name. Conservatives are natural conservationists. But I will defend Malud in front of any judge in the land the proposition that property rights are the best thing that can happen to the environment. That I'm speaking to you from Hampshire. I have seen an obvious increase, a palpable increase in biodiversity and cleaner air over my lifetime. The Thames was declared biologically dead in the 50s. You've now got salmon there. About 5 years ago, I saw an otter in the wild for the first time in my life. I would have doubted my eyes, except you can hardly mistake an otter for anything else. I didn't see the big avian apex predator in this ecosystem is the red kite. Huge kind of eagle-sized birds, very, very beautiful in flight. I had not seen one in the wild before I was in my 30s. Now they are as common as pigeons around here. And that has happened because we're a rich country and we have the resources and the will to clean things up. And it doesn't happen in poor countries because, you have deforestation when people are still needing the firewood, cooking indoors, needing slash and burn agriculture. We're past that. You have the hunting of rare species when people need to protect their own livestock and they can't afford to shoot them with cameras instead of guns. Wealth is the best thing that can happen. And the real flaw in the whole Greta Thunberg ideology is, we tried centralized control. The basis of the Soviet Union was that bureaucratic, top-down, total control that the Greenies want. And what did it create? It turned the Aral Sea into a desert. It turned the Volga into a sewer. Passengers on ferries on the Volga were warned not to throw cigarettes overboard because there was so much oil in the water. The best thing in my lifetime to have happened to the environment was the fall of the Berlin Wall.
And take that to its further logical conclusion. I think I heard this first from a colleague of yours, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who pointed out that if you go to any nice British countryside town, you can compare the private garden of any random house to the median strip and how it's looked after by the local council. And there is all you need to see in terms of who really cares about the environment, never mind the regulations that are passed. But obviously, if you have a vested interest in a particular plot of land, you're going to look after it. If you don't, well, you won't.
And the common law is very good at extending that principle. It's fascinating the extent to which conservationism was happening already long before anyone had come up with a name for it. There was a case in the 18th century where a mine using new technology had caused a flood, and the person whose land had been flooded sued the mining company. Now, the court, this was unencountered. The court had never before had to deal because there hadn't been steam-powered mining equipment. It was a new technology. But they applied the ancient common law principle that if you had a dangerous thing in your control, you had to keep it under leash. And the dangerous thing in this case, ruled the court, was the flood. The miner had failed to keep the dangerous thing under control and therefore was liable. And actually, there was a case as long ago as the 16th century. There was a guy in Malmesbury who protested that a pig farmer had moved in next door and that the smell of the pig farm was violating his property rights. It was deleterious to his quality of life. And the judge said, yeah, actually, when you moved there, there weren't pigs next door. You have, as it were, your property rights extend vertically to the particles that you're having to breathe in from the pig farm. So we've been really good at this. And I was astonished to discover that I think England was among maybe the first jurisdiction to have regulations on water purity and cleanliness of rivers. Those regulations were actually demanded by the companies that had the factories that were discharging into the water. And the reason was private citizens were suing them successfully. And they were saying, you are violating our property rights by polluting the water where I like to walk my dog. And so the companies went to the government and said, will you please establish a kind of minimum level where if we meet these criteria, we cannot then be sued by a private citizen. In other words, the property rights were the thing that was driving the clean environment long before there was any government intervention.
You've been so generous with your time. Thank you so much, Daniel. One final question. We're talking about private property rights there. One thing that might even be upstream of that is free expression. Now, both your country and my country in recent times, we've had all sorts of scandals with people being arrested for Facebook posts or saying the wrong thing online, quite often this is, which raises the question, I think you've raised this recently perhaps on social media, does Britain in particular need a First Amendment like the United States?
It's certainly the case that the US has avoided what has happened in every other Anglosphere country, in your country, in mine, in Canada, because of the First Amendment. And it is unthinkable that the US would not have gone the same way as the rest of us from the 90s, really, had it not had that legal protection. I think there is look, we're a parliamentary system. So we've always had this idea that the Parliament is supreme. We don't have a Supreme Court. The defence of freedom is therefore our direct responsibility as voters. We don't hand it over to some tribunal. That has obviously been much weaker since basically Tony Blair and the creation of something called a Supreme Court and the passing of legislation which, although in theory it is just one more law like any other, when we passed the Human Rights Act or the Climate Change Act, it is treated as much more than just one more law. It's treated much more like the US Bill of Rights. So given where we're starting from now, given how far we've drifted from pure parliamentarism, I think there is a case for revisiting the question of what we regard as fundamental rights. And I would bind this question up with the whole issue whether we leave the European Convention on Human Rights, which is now a piece of legislation that is driving a level of judicial activism hitherto unencountered by our system. The problem is absolutely with our own courts, but nonetheless, it is the provisions of the ECHR that are giving them the excuse to legislate from the bench. So I think if we replaced the ECHR with a Bill of Rights of our own. In fact, I would actually just take the 1689 Bill of Rights and tweak it slightly. We don't need all the stuff about Catholics not being allowed to bear arms. We could do with some more stuff on free speech. There's actually a very the origin of free speech as a right is in the Bill of Rights in the sense that what is said in Parliament can't be impeached. It would be a small amendment to extend that principle further and to say anything legal, anything that stops short of incitement is free speech. By the way, just one point which I think is maybe of interest to listeners. The narrative on the loss of free speech in the UK, I think, is slightly wrong. The narrative most popularly seen is something like Blair passed a whole bunch of terrible laws that elevated the sensitivities of minorities over the rights of free expression, and the Tories uselessly failed to repeal those laws, and now we're reaping the consequence. And there's some truth in that. Definitely there are some Blair-era laws that we need to repeal. Agreed. But if we look at the most egregious cases of people being arrested for tweeting, generally the law under which they were seized was the 1986 Public Order Act. This is a Margaret Thatcher era piece of legislation against incitement, fundamentally. And, you have an incitement law. We've had one forever. The Americans have one. There's nothing, almost every serious country accepts that, if I said, let's go and, burn down the house of the guy next door, that is not just words. But what used to happen is that you needed to show that there was a realistic chance of the guy's house being burnt down as a direct consequence of my words. In other words, it had to be an actual incitement rather than just saying that guy's a complete so-and-so, right? And what has happened recently is that fundamentally the police have started reinterpreting that law to mean that any kind of offence caused to people in protected castes, scheduled castes, people with protected characteristics, i.e. gay people, trans people, ethnic minorities, whatever, anything that makes them feel uncomfortable is ipso facto a kind of incitement. There's no legislative basis for that. What we're seeing is the impact of decades of DEI in the public sector. All these, a lot of these people who are not maybe the brightest people in the first place, but who have been repeatedly sent on these courses about white privilege and all the rest of it, now believing that they are carrying out the law. And I think it's really important to grasp that, because the solution is not as simple as repealing some obnoxious statute. If it were, we'd have done it by now. There's a much deeper problem of deprogramming chunks of the criminal justice system, and particularly the police.
Thank you so much for your time again, Daniel. This has genuinely been an honour for me. As I say, I've been a fan of yours for well over a decade when I began watching those speeches of yours on YouTube about why to leave the EU and just defending freedom in general. So I encourage everyone to look up Daniel Hannan on YouTube, because as you will have seen from this conversation here, he has that rare gift of being an educator and an entertainer all in one. So thanks again, Daniel, for being associated with the Conjecture Institute in particular, and for talking to me today.
Thank you so much, Brett. Great pleasure.